Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to another ad hoc session of Islamic Conversations with myself, al-Azami, to discuss the Parkview saga, or what's been recently referred to as the Trojan Horse affair in a New York Times serial podcast. It's my great honor to welcome two important players in this podcast. One who is behind the scenes and one who is really up front and central from episode one. Brother Tahir Alam from Birmingham was, of course, is now the former governor, chair of the governors of Parkview Academy, or the Parkview Educational Trust. And Brother Talha Ahmad actually acted as his solicitor in the case brought against Tahir Alam by the government, which has resulted in his banning. And so this is an opportunity for us to actually have a conversation and hear from the horse's mouth, as it were, the case that was made against him and the sorts of problems that arise and that have happily been sort of brought to the fore by the New York Times sort of podcast. I'd like to first recommend everyone who hasn't listened to the New York Times podcast immediately to go to the serial Trojan Horse Affair sort of podcast series. It'll be the best 8 hours you've spent in a very long time, and just listen to it. It's beautifully produced, fantastic, gripping narrative, and it tells the story of Brother Tahir Alam and the school that he was involved in, and the way in which that had a massive impact on Muslims across the country, and indeed on education across the country, and the way in which we understand even the very fundamental question of what are British values, which suddenly became a question in this context. With that, I'd like to first invite Brother Tahir, if you would like to sort of open up with maybe a brief reflection on this entire saga and what sort of position you were put in after an illustrious career as a sort of educationalist in the city of Birmingham.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and jazakallah for inviting me. If you're going to sort of focus on some of the I suppose the legal aspects and the barring element of it, I think it's important to say that why did this whole matter go to barring people anyway in the first place? Because this is very, very unusual in this country. In fact, I'm the first person to be barred under this particular protocol under the Education Skills Act under Section 128. In other words, which refers to, that basically deals with the idea of a person's conduct being inappropriate to be leading education institutions. So my barring order essentially, covers running schools, working in education, basically. But that was the section under which it was done. But the reason why this was pursued was because these were recommendations. This is part of the recommendations made by Peter Clark in his report at the end. So he wanted certain individuals to be barred, governors to be barred, teachers to be barred from working in schools. And there are many other changes that were suggested as well. And maybe if we get time, we might look at some of them. But one of them was this one. So when the Department of Education, when this came out, the Department of Education said, we will try to act on these. And as part of that recommendation, then they went about, some sort of about 7-8 months later, I received a letter to say that the Department of Education, were minded to bar me. So this is through an administrative process, just for understanding purposes. So it's not a judicial process. So it's a bit like the department saying, you've come to our notice and you've done this, that, and the other, and we are minded to bar you, and you can appeal that particular decision. Sorry, you can respond to our intention to bar you, and we will then arrive at a decision. So when that happened, I said to them that I like to respond in person. So if you want to bar me, for the reasons that you've stated, rather than just submit my response to you in writing, I want to be do it in real life, if you like. But then I wanted to meet with them as well, and they said no, we're not going to attend a meeting at all, and you just reply to our objections and our intention, and then we will decide. So I did that. I put some responses together to their initial accusations and things. And the next thing I knew was I was barred. That's it. So I received a letter saying that we don't accept your responses and you're barred. So it's not a judicial process. Then if you want to appeal that process, then it will go to a tribunal, which will go to a tribunal court, basically.
Right.
So then I appealed that particular decision, and that's when Talha came on board to help me
Right.
do all of that, to
Right.
take the matter, submit the matter to a tribunal. So that's a little bit about the process so people understand here.
This is an opportune time to bring in Talha Ahmad, who is a sort of experienced lawyer working in London, and someone who's worked closely with the MCB. You also have worked, of course, closely with the MCB. And in a sense, what strikes me as unusual about this resembles certain types of administrative sort of regulations that governments can institute, which seem to, in some respects, limit citizens' rights of redress or rights of appeal or rights of responding. Talha, you could perhaps correct me on this, but it resembles to me like visa applications in the UK, or for example, the fact that now they've introduced this draconian policy effectively directed at Muslims and other immigrants who are potentially seen as problematic, for whom, without any notice or without informing these people, they can be deprived of their citizenship in the UK. And as far as I understand, this is currently on the law books. This is currently something that the Home Office can enact without informing any one of us, because all three of us, for example, will either ourselves have been born abroad or will have had parents who are from abroad, and therefore will be eligible for another sort of passport somewhere else in all likelihood. So in what way is the mechanism used to bar Brother Tahir a mechanism that is really, in many respects, authoritarian? It's a way of imposing state policy without any kind of redress. And in what way is that perhaps ironic in a context of a democracy where we take pride in the rule of law and in supposed British values, which are about democracy, rule of law, as we'll talk about later on in the session?
Yeah, I think the process per se is not problematic. It is used in a range of other professional settings. And I'm not comparing with the provision in relation to citizenship. That's a much more complex area. Again, I'm sure if you want to, I can talk about it at another time. Now, in this situation, just very quickly picking on the process that was followed. So Tahir Alam was effectively served a notice of intention to bar him under a regulation that was brought in 2014. And the regulation was brought in under a power given in a statute of 2008. And I don't really want to mention each one of them.
Sure.
So we had a number of concerns. I got involved at the stage when we appealed the decision at a tribunal. And our concern was manifold. First and foremost, the regulation that was used was applied retrospectively. So we said that it is against the rule of law principle that somebody should be tried or sanctioned because of a conduct which at the time was not problematic but was made problematic afterwards.
Right.
So none of the conduct that was accused of, all of those conducts predated the law that was brought in, the secondary legislation that was brought in.
Right.
Now, tribunal, for whatever reason, did not find in our favor. The other concern that we had was that the allegations against him were very flimsy. So, for example, it was said that he undermined fundamental British values of democracy, rule of law, and respect and tolerance for views of others. Now, we understand what that means in terms of superficially, but which specific conduct or on what occasion did Tahir Alam do something which amounted to undermining fundamental British values? So we were never given a list of allegations, specific conduct of Tahir Alam, which they say amounted to a breach of fundamental British values. And then there was the issue of what is fundamental British values. So again, the value itself was never defined. And one of the things that we hoped, and we were disappointed, was that we hoped that the court would use that opportunity to define what fundamental British values is and what is the threshold that amounts to undermining that fundamental British values. As it happens, the tribunal in this instance did not make any finding on the fundamental British values. In fact, it simply did not engage in its decision, a very lengthy decision. The second ground on which he was banned was on the ground that his conduct was so inappropriate that he was not a person suitable for being involved in the management of an independent school. Now again, what amounts to so inappropriate and what specific conduct were they relying on? So going back to the procedure again, it was defective not because not because of the provision made in law. It was defective because in our view the provisions were not properly followed. So the law says you can serve somebody notice if you think that they have done X, Y, and Z, right? But in our view, they didn't serve notice specifying exactly what happened. To draw an analogy, if you're accused of, let's say, theft, they will say you are accused of being acted in breach of Theft Act, whatever the provision is, and then they'll list that on X and Y or Z time you have taken this object from somebody which belonged to somebody else and taken it. So they will say what your offense is, and they will identify which specific conduct amounts to that offense. In this case, they've identified what they say Tahir Alam's offense was, but did not say in practical terms what did he do to commit that offense, right? So in our view, that was problematic. But there are other issues also. I don't believe it was deliberate or systematic, but there are other issues. So in this case, we had to go to a first-year tribunal, social care chambers. Now, usually that tribunal deals with some of the most basic stuff. It's at the very bottom end of the legal structure. But the issues that we were arguing on touched upon some of the fundamental core foundation of our constitution. So the Bill of Rights was in question, the rule of law was in question, freedom of speech was in question, and we ended up having a 2 weeks trial in a first-year tribunal. But there was no mechanism to escalate it to the High Court. The only way you could escalate it is through various ranks. By at least after 2 separate appeals, you would have ended up in the High Court. And even when you do end up in High Court, they would have very limited powers. They cannot make finding of facts. That's reserved for the first-year tribunal, because that is the court of first instance. So procedurally, I would say that the defect was not following the procedure properly, and also the law not making provision to recognize that some of the issues that may arise under that provision could be so fundamental that a first-year tribunal is not a fit and proper competent authority to try that. I don't know if you want me to address any of the allegations.
I wanted to ask, and hopefully we will have the opportunity to go into some of these allegations in more detail according to what Brother Tahir wants as well. And I want to hand over to Brother Tahir in just a moment. I just wanted a small clarification. When you say a first-year tribunal, if you can, to sort of audience members who might be completely unfamiliar, very briefly and simply explain sort of how the ranking system works.
In England, we have, broadly speaking, 2 sets of judiciary. We've got the criminal court, which starts with magistrate court, and then you've got Crown Court, High Court, Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court. In civil, you would have the county courts, the High Court, Court of Appeal, and the Supreme Court. And then outside these 2, you have specialist chambers. So, for example, if you apply for housing benefit and your benefit get refused, you will go to the first-year tribunal. And then if you fail at first-year tribunal, you'll go to upper tribunal. Upper tribunal often has High Court equivalent status. And then you'd go to the High Court, depending on which upper tribunal you're on. And then you'll go to Court of Appeal and so on. So this first year tribunal is at the very bottom end and designed to deal with very relatively straightforward specialist issues. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. Whereas dealing with something as complex as defining or setting the legal parameters of the idea of British values would seem to be something, suitable for the High Court or even higher, perhaps. Is that reasonable?
You wouldn't be higher. I mean, High Court would be the right place. So,
Okay,
for
okay.
example, in criminal case,
Right.
you would usually go to anything that involves jury trial, you'll go to Crown Court. In
Okay.
civil case, so when a case is complex or of high value, instead of going to county court, you would go to the High Court. High Court can act as a court of first instance. But on this occasion, we couldn't because we had to go to first year tribunal. The statute specified that we must appeal at the first year tribunal.
This is the statute with respect to the 2008 regulation that you mentioned earlier about education.
2008 Act. The
Okay.
regulation is from 2014.
Right. Okay.
The
So
regulation, I mean, just for clarity, a regulation was brought in after the whole Trojan horse affair is blown out. So the regulation was brought in to deal with something that happened in the past and discipline people for their past conduct.
Right, which is, just doesn't, I've studied some basic legal philosophy at postgraduate level, and this just seems to go against everything I understand about, retrospective laws being completely meaningless.
I mean, a fundamental principle of English law or the rule of law regime that we have is that we do not retrospectively punish people. There are some very exceptions. But in general, any government or any country that sanction people retrospectively is seen as not governed by rule of law.
Right. What a place to arrive at, Tahir Bhai. Where you've brought our country's legal system into disrepute at this stage.
That's right. It seems that they were so hell bent on, it seems to me, on banning me that they brought in a special law, to enact the regulations and enact the capacity to do that via introducing a new regulation, especially for myself, and applying that retrospectively as well. So it just doesn't bode well really for the legal system. And what were my offences? As Talha said, actually, they didn't even list them. So what are my offences then? My offences were, they were picking up everything procedural, if you like, within the school. So, for example, if a teacher did something in the school, or there was a policy breach or something like that, that's obvious, and that's been put into as if that's an action that I have taken. That's to do with my conduct.
Right.
Now, anybody who knows the ABC of governance and running organizations, obviously, that you have the policies in place. If the policies are not in place, if the policies are promoting intolerance, if the policies are promoting inappropriate behavior in some shape or form, then you could say actually the policies are at flaw, and then it's directly my responsibility. For example, if a boy in a school punches another girl, okay, I'm just saying as an example, does that mean that girls are being beaten up by boys, and therefore I'm responsible for somehow promoting the idea of the girls should be beaten up by boys? I mean, it is a ridiculous proposition. But that's what they were doing. So the accusation against me were very kind of things that happen in the school. And Mr. Alam, they are your overall responsibility, aren't they? And overall responsibility I have to accept. But when you're talking about my conduct, they are not actually part of my conduct, because most of those things I didn't even have any knowledge of if there was an incident that took place. There are a few incidents that they do code which actually are misrepresented. As in the case of something I mentioned before about the terrorist video in the school. There was no terrorist video in the school, at all. And that particular incident goes back years. They dug this incident from years before. It's not now So when
Yeah.
you read the newspapers and things, you think, oh, it was happening now. So there were
Yeah.
children are being shown these kind of things. But the reality was this is something that happened years ago. And they dug it up and presented it as a part of my misconduct, if you like.
Can I interject briefly, just to say a couple of things? One is, Talha bhai, when you're not speaking, I'm going to be muting your mic. So if you would like to interject, please unmute, because there's a bit of interference coming from you. But the other thing is, can I ask Talha bhai just to come in and comment on? I mean, this strikes me as very unusual. As you said, it seems like it's not a rule of law system. If the way in which these rules are being applied is so arbitrary. As Tahir Bhai said, he should not have responsibility for the minutiae of actual practice. He's responsible for policy. So what's going on here?
So even, I mean, going a step further, let's say for argument's sake that the chair of governor can be held responsible for operational aspect. Let's say for the moment that it can be.
Sure.
Your first port of call would be to discipline those who are operationally responsible. Head teacher, assistant head teacher, and so on. As far as I'm aware, none of the teachers were accused of these conducts, and in any event, none of them were disciplined. In fact, the proceedings against them at a different, again, very low-level disciplinary process, their cases were thrown out. So none of the you have an extraordinary situation where operational failures were identified, but none of the operational leadership were held accountable. And yet, Tahir Alam gets effectively barred for life on those grounds. The other issue also you had is when you discipline somebody for their conduct, you would have a range of thresholds. So, for example, your conduct is at the gravest end, so you get barred for life. Or your conduct is at a relatively lower end of the seriousness. It is serious, but at the lower end. Then you might get barred for 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, whatever. But none of those were at play. So it seemed as if the only outcome that we could put up with is that he has to be barred.
Indefinitely.
I mean,
barred for life, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
And Tahir Bhai, I mean, it strikes me, and you can, give me your reading on this. It strikes me as that, this is basically specially designed for you, right? I mean, this entire episode has been about, okay, and permit me some speculation. You've been named in the Trojan Horse affair. A lot of people see that you're really turning around these schools, and they're mixing that in with, of course, deeply Islamophobic prejudice about, well, actually, these are also reflecting the ethos. So hopefully we'll also talk a bit about this undue religious influence idea, if you'd like. And so this is just a special law or a special application of the law or a sort of an act so that they can get rid of you. You're the MCB education sort of like liaison. You're doing so much work. I mean, you basically never get any rest from what I can tell looking at your CV. You're just constantly at it, and they need to neutralize you, right? What was so threatening about you? Perhaps you can explain to us.
I mean, I'm lost for myself, actually. I mean, I was well regarded, of course, up until, all these things happened. And we had plenty of accolades. We were well recognized. We had school leaders, even governors coming from other cities and things to come and look at what we're doing, sharing a good practice. We were very open to that.
Right.
And I myself have worked as a national leader of governance. So I was one of the Department for Education's leader of governance. I was a governance expert. Right. And I worked as an Ofsted inspector, as you know. And also as a school improvement consultant. And these are the jobs that I did. And worked for the local authority as well, responsibility for training governors in 70 schools. So this was my role. This is what I was doing. This is what I loved doing. But all of a sudden, of course, there was, I think there was, a change in, if you like, of government in 2010. Some new policies were coming in as well. You had the open big society, agenda moving through. As part of that, academization was introduced.
Right.
and that was supposed to afford more freedoms to people and so on. And I think that perhaps in that movement of having more free schools and greater freedoms within education, if you are an Islamophobe, then obviously you were not quite thinking that some Muslims might take advantage of this particular change and
Right.
an opening up of the education arena.
Right.
And I think that what some
Michael
people did
Gove.
not like somewhere was that we had now Muslims running these academies, running them very successfully maybe, and they were not so warm to that particular idea, and that's not
Right.
what they had in mind. And perhaps and I think that played an element, that played a certain role in all of that, the policy dimension possibly. But
So
most of it is driven actually by, I mean, in the end, what it was, following the circulation of the Trojan horse letter, it quickly, obviously, immediately turned into an Islamophobic witch hunt.
right.
And a decision was taken very early on that we have to remove these people, and
Right.
and the rest of it is just a show, it's just a facade. And
Right.
I've said this from the outset that the subsequent reports, whether they are Ofsted reports, Peter Clark's report, Ian Kershaw's report, and the Education Funding Agency's report, they're all government agencies. The Ofsted
Right.
inspections were triggered by the Secretary of State for Education, Michael Gove. He triggered
Right.
them.
Right.
So they're all part of the same thing. It's not 4 reports. It's
Right.
one report
Right.
trying
Right.
to achieve the same thing. And what is
And
remarkable and what is really noteworthy is, which is reflective of the mindset. And this is why it was impossible for our schools to be inspected fairly under Ofsted. It was impossible for our schools to be investigated by the Education Funding Agency or the PwC or whoever the other investigator, and Kershaw and so on. It was impossible for that because if you just look at one of them, Michael Gove appointed Peter Clark, who is a counter-terrorism policeman. Okay,
Right.
counterterrorism policeman, and he sent him in to investigate education. Now, what does that say? Is there any possibility for us to have a fair hearing here? The answer is no. By the simple appointment that this is what so they were looking for extremists, terrorists, and people who are radicalizing the children, if you like, in some shape or form. In the end, quite early on, actually, they knew quite early on, they knew that there was nothing inappropriate going on here during the Ofsted inspections. And the reason why I say that is because the guy who they sent from the due diligence team, who happened to be a Muslim background, so he was going to sort of look at the Muslim aspect of the inspection. So that was his job to do that. When the inspections finished, he was part of the EFA team actually. He came over to us and he said, "Ooh, I don't see anything inappropriate here at all." He said this to me, and he said this to the principal as well. He said to him, "I see in what you're doing, your Friday prayers, your Islamic collective worship in the morning, and the other provisions that you're making in terms of uniform and so on." He said, "I see nothing wrong with any of them." These are his words.
Right.
Okay, so obviously, whatever he had, he was there to look at that particular remit.
Yeah.
But his remit completely disappeared.
Yeah.
His notes that he would have made going around, they were never disclosed in the bundle. He just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Right.
From the protocol point of view, somebody else wrote all the notes. So what I'm saying to you is that these inspections, these reports upon which many of these articles are relying, no, they basically are not credible. And I've always, from the beginning, I have challenged their credibility, their fairness, right from the start. So this is the position I've always held, because the depiction and the characterization of individuals, that's myself and other people as well as the characterization of our institutions, actually is pretty much fictional. It's very difficult for me when I read those reports. I kind of think that I'm reading about some other school. It's not the school that I was part of at all. So those are my kind of sentiments, if you like, and my experiences of that.
So Tahir, I just realized you're not wearing your headphones, and perhaps there might be some echo as a consequence. So are you wearing headphones? Oh, you. Okay, you are. Sorry, I just thought I had heard some echo, but it's probably just my system misbehaving. I wanted to just reflect again. We live ostensibly in a system of rule of law, but what you've described, as you put it, is basically a witch hunt. It's a situation where the academy system is brought in by Michael Gove, who incidentally in his Celsius 77 uses the term Trojan horse to refer to Muslims, as stated in, I think, the podcast itself. And from that, which is written, if I recall correctly, in 2006, 2007, he comes into the becomes the Minister for Education in the cabinet, and he's now starting his own project of academization. We have an Islamophobe in the Ministry of Education. Isn't this inevitable that he's going to come after you? Basically, I mean, there's an inevitability to it. Now, the problem, of course, is that from a legal standpoint, how can this be justified? This is what I'm really sort of struggling to put my head around, and perhaps Talha, you can sort of.
I don't necessarily believe that all these government agencies colluded and conspired.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Can I just make the point? So to come to a predetermined outcome. However, what I do think, what I did feel at the time, and I certainly feel more so now with passage of time and time for reflection, is that Islamophobia within the wider establishment and indeed society was so rife that when these allegations were raised against some Muslims supposedly practicing, instead of using the natural response, which is to probe them, question them, almost every institution, the government, civil society, and indeed the media, they were almost ready and willing to digest it without any serious health check. And that is the most depressing bit, unfortunately.
Right. But I would suggest, Talha, and please feel free to sort of like respond to this and sort of critique it, as someone who thinks about the way in which racisms work and the way in which prejudice works. It is systemic. It's not something which it's implicit bias. It's not something which people are consciously, certainly people like, all the editors of the sort of British press would not say proudly, I am an Islamophobe. I mean, you do have the occasional person, unfortunately, who does say that, but most people say, no, this is sort of like entirely unreasonable. I'm not prejudiced against Muslims, because prejudice against any group is seen as unacceptable. But then you ask them, okay, well, what's an acceptable Muslim to you? And then most of us, because we think it's an obligation to pray, or because we have certain what they would consider to be conservative views, would suddenly be seen as persona non grata in sort of various contexts. And I think that that's fundamentally the problem. The problem isn't that they aren't conscious Islamophobes. The problem is that they are unconscious Islamophobes because they think we're so tolerant, we're going to be intolerant of these intolerant people. And they framed us in that way. Sorry, you're on mic, unmute. Sorry.
I absolutely agree with that. I think the point, in fact, I'd add an example that we had a similar situation where one of the witness giving evidence, a senior teacher from one of the schools, who provided evidence that the school, that particular school, was turned into an Islamic school, and under cross-examination, she was asked how. Well, Arabic was used everywhere, and what was that Arabic? Now, in the end, it turned out that the students were saying salam to each other, assalamu alaikum, right? And that that was problematic. When that particular teacher was asked, do you know what it means? That particular teacher didn't know. I'm saying that particular teacher because the court has directed that this person cannot be identified.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
So, so that person was found that assalamu alaikum problematic, even though that person did not know, despite teaching in a school for years, which was overwhelmingly Muslim dominated, did not know the meaning of salam, but found it problematic. So our counsel asked, as a sort of to make a lighter of this, so he asked, if you see me, you're agnostic, correct? Yes. So if you see me on the street sneezing, what would you do? And this particular individual responded saying, I would say, bless you. And so our counsel said, do you realize that it is, this bless you comes, its root is in Christianity, deeply rooted in Christian faith. But you are agnostic. Why are you using it? Does it make you a devout Christian? So it shows, I'm illustrating the point that the institutional ignorance and bias, be it unconscious or otherwise, was so deeply ingrained that something as simple as Assalamu alaikum was seen as problematic and as evidence of extremism.
Yeah. So, this goes back to something which is very clearly stated in the podcast, which is one of the complaints was, Arabic was being encouraged and European languages was not, Arabic and Urdu or something like this. And this is somehow creeping Islamization. Now, people being more in touch with their historical heritage is something which, growing up in my household, my father would not respond to me unless I was speaking Bengali, for example. And that's how we preserved a certain degree of, attachment to our historical homeland, so to speak. And I feel deeply enriched by that, the fact that I can actually listen to Bengali poetry, albeit simple, and understand it. And it enriches me as a person. I feel that. And I can relate to members of my family back home as well. But that is suddenly criminalized on some level when it comes to Arabic. I'm sure some of these people, if they went to someone praying and saw someone giving the adhan, would say, "Oh, there's a jihadi cry in the basketball hall or something like this." That's the level of course, paranoia about Islam that we're dealing with. I wonder. I wanted to sort of ask a very specific question, but it slipped my mind, Tahir Bhai. But please feel free to sort of interject here with any reflections.
You're asking about the Arabic, actually. Arabic.
Okay.
So what did we do with the Arabic? As you know, as part of the requirements for the curriculum, we offer various languages within school. We offered 3 languages: Spanish, French, and Arabic language were offered. And I think about half of our children did Arabic. We had one group of children who did Urdu, I think, and there was one French. French was not a full class, actually, probably half a class or something like that. So those are the 3 languages that we offered. And obviously, those are optional. So children choose them. So nearly half of our children chose Arabic to do that, which is well within the legal requirement. It's one of the listed languages on the Department for Education website. It is the 3rd most desired language to be learned according to the recommendations of the Foreign Office, if you know what I mean, because there's a trade link that they want to establish those things. So it's number 3 on the list. So if children are learning Arabic, it's kind of modern spoken Arabic. It's not Quranic Arabic or anything like that. It's modern spoken Arabic. We're teaching the GCSE in Arabic language is what we are teaching, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So when the Education Funding Agency people came in, they were all over Arabic. They thought they shouldn't be doing that. They're forcing children to go into Arabic, and this is what they were kind of looking at. And they wanted to know what the Arabic writing was on there. And so this was the kind of paranoia. What we were doing was very normal, absolutely normal.
I wonder if
they'll have any objection to that whatsoever.
I want to interject on that.
Please.
There was one occasion when to one of the, I believe it was one of the Ofsted inspector, I can't remember now, and I was reading this transcript just a little while ago. There was a leaflet about Syria. And that had a lot of Arabic terms and so on. And so it was effectively characterized as problematic, as evidence of extremism. So under cross-examination, when our counsel took that individual through everything that was used, that person eventually came to a conclusion and conceded that there is nothing wrong about this poster. So when you look at it, there is nothing wrong. And yet, just because it was about Syria and just because it had a lot of Arabic in it, it suddenly flagged up as something problematic. Not only this, even when the individual considered that the content of the leaflet had nothing problematic at all, even then, the individual could not accept it as acceptable, saying that, but it was in a maths class. So unfortunately, there are a lot of these things where it was perfectly normal thing to do, But because the consumption in the wider society, in the media, was ready to consume something about Muslim, even if it wasn't factually right,
But again,
assumptions were made, and
I would be a bit harder
yeah,
than that, to be honest. I
sorry.
would be a bit harder than that because the people inspecting the schools, Talha, they were given a little instruction, the wink and the nod instruction. They were told to take the school down. And they invented a lot of these things. They colored the whole inspection framework and their investigations to reach that particular outcome. So in the legal case, as you very well know, Talha, what were they saying? That that the inspections were fair and that we went about it in a very normal way. They were not influenced by the Trojan horse letter. Do you recall that?
yes, I
They were
do.
minimizing any references to the Trojan horse letter. It was nothing to do with that. Yeah. But the Trojan horse letter was landed on the Department for Education's desk on the 13th of December. Yeah. And they were planning all of that. So let me quote from the papers for the audiences listening. Here we go. So this is now the planning. These are the release documents from the Department for Education, and I quote one of them here. This is a conversation between the Academy's team and Ofsted between themselves, and they say, suffice it to say, quote, suffice it to say, we will take action via Parkview School with Ofsted. Now, looking at that wording and the tone of the wording, who would in their right mind think that we're going to get a fair inspection here?
I think
I mean,
Talha bhai,
just to,
yes,
just to add to that point, this issue featured significantly in the cross-examination, and it was effectively established that there were some degree of coordination between Ofsted, the Education Funding Agency, Department for Education. What was also frustrating is that we did seek further disclosure, certainly in relation to meetings of minutes and various meetings between the Secretary of State for Education, his special advisors, and others. Unfortunately, we didn't make much progress on it. But even on the documents which were disclosed, as I think one of those Tahir Alam read from, even on the documents disclosed, and even in cross-examination, it was pretty clear that there were some degree of coordination between different agencies. Now, I will not go so far as to say they were necessarily conspiring to achieve a specific outcome. Tahir Alam is at liberty to make that assertion. If
yes, you're a lawyer, of course, you be careful with your words, but I would share Tahir Bhai's suspicion on those sorts of grounds. But that's the thing. These are suspicions which we have very carefully been prevented from accessing the material that would allow us to, affirm these in a court of law, unfortunately. And I find it highly problematic, of course, that the state has the right to do that to us, that they can refuse to issue disclosures which would be exonerating for someone like Tahir Bhai.
Well, I think one of the other issues you have is, so some of it is a little less, more subtle.
Clear-cut.
So, for example,
Okay.
we had nearly 30 lever arch folders worth of papers that was disclosed to us. Now, you tell me how anyone can afford unless they are very, very wealthy, how can they ever afford to have lawyers to go through all of those and prepare a case? Now, Tahir Alam
It's a
had
good
no
strategy.
funding Tahir Alam had no funding unless he put the money himself, right? It was, on the other hand, we had in the government, in fact, the lead counsel that acted for the government, he has since become a high court judge. So you had one of the top legal brain, assisted by another top senior junior, and then you had a government machinery, 5 or 6 solicitors as a team working to advance that.
Of course.
Whereas we had no funding. I mean, we did get some funding in the end, but it was very minimal compared to...
So this is the irony of seeking justice against a state, right? Because the state has really unlimited resources. Ironically, of course, Tahir Bhai, you also funded your own prosecution because you pay your taxes, right? We all do. We all paid for your prosecution, unfortunately. The state has those resources. But we, of course, the victims of the state, when it is headed up by determined Islamophobes in my estimation, and I think that's perfectly reasonable to say about people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, because they've got this sort of stuff on record, and even their allies have described that, or quote unquote allies, people like Peter Oborne have described them as such. And what do you have? I mean, this is Talha, I mean, maybe I'm being overly dramatic, but what use is the rule of law if you can crush people like insects, as I think Inam Malik said on the podcast, right?
Well, I think one of the things I will digress to broader areas for a moment.
Yeah.
Having been in this system, practicing for more than a decade now,
Of course, yeah.
I have grown to believe that while our system of law remains one of the best compared to others, it has serious drawbacks. So I give you one small example. If you're an elderly man of an ethnic background who does not speak English, I think structurally you are almost against huge odds to ensure that you are a credible, honest, and reliable witness, right?
Yeah.
And I have seen time and time again where, due to cultural reasons, so for example, in our culture, we often do not maintain eye contact, especially when you're speaking to persons of authority, right?
Yeah.
Now, I had one incident where an elderly Bengali man, he didn't maintain eye contact, and it was seen as evidence that he was trying to be evasive and did not want to engage with the question. So there are many structural issues, and unfortunately, I think in this case, many of those little issues together became even bigger and more complex.
So I wanted to shift to something slightly different, which was the idea of religion and secularism, because one of the things that is asserted here is you are making secular schools religious. And I mean, one of the things that is mentioned in the podcast is there any such thing as a secular school in this country? Doesn't the I think it's primary legislation which says that you have to read a common prayer in the morning in a school? Christian prayer,
Christian
typically.
Nature, collective worship. But before I go to that, I want to emphasize this. I think, look, I dealt with this issue both in this case, but also at the height of Trojan Horse. I was effectively the main point of contact for MCB. So I've done hundreds of interviews on this. And I have problem with this notion of secular school turned Islamic. As we have seen in Tahir Alam's case, there wasn't a single allegation that he turned those schools into Islamic school. Or let alone fundamentalist school or extremist school and so on. He wasn't accused and charged and prosecuted on those, right? Although everything in the media would suggest that was the main reason. And in evidence, there was no evidence. None of the teacher or the witnesses who gave evidence, they could not point to one thing that would constitute something that goes over and beyond what would be generally acceptable religiosity in any setting. So nobody did turn any of these schools into Islamic school. They remained state secular school who were catering for the cultural, religious, social needs of their children.
Can I contest that slightly in an unusual way, perhaps?
Go ahead.
For me, it's like we live in a country where the head of state is the head of church. We technically live, I'm just saying in formal technical sense, we live in a theocracy. We live in a theocracy. So, if the head of the church is the head, and she's the defender of the faith, right? She's the defender of the Church of England. If that's the case, why is it a problem if we accept the principle of religious pluralism for a school to have some Islamic identity if 99% of its students are Muslim? And that's something that the parents desire. It's something that the students desire. What's wrong with having an Islamic ethos?
I'm not suggesting for a moment there's anything wrong with it. What I'm saying is that, in fact, there has always been argument, and Tahir Alam has been involved in it as well, that many people campaign there needs to be more faith schools of Islamic and other faiths. To reflect the demography of our country. What I'm trying to say is that the schools in questions, none of them were turned into Islamic schools. They were not turned into Islamic schools. There was nothing in the practices of those schools which could be
could constitute as the school's character having been changed. So it wasn't the case. So
Sure.
what I'm saying is there are 2 points here.
What's
I
an
think
Islamic school, though?
Well,
How would you define an Islamic school?
that's a very good question, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Within, if I can address that thing.
Yes,
within,
please. Tahir.
within law, in this country, historically, as you know, the vast majority of schools were faith schools. They came into the state sector,
Right.
and so on. So for a school to have, for the school to say overtly promote religion in a way which is where the religious view is presented as truth, if you like.
Right. Right.
You need a school you need the school to have what is called a religious designation. Okay?
Interesting. Okay.
So
okay.
on its license, it has to have a religious designation that you're a faith school. Okay, there's no such thing as faith school in the actual language, but commonly understood as faith school. But the legal reference is in having a religious designation.
I see. Okay.
So for example, your Islamic schools, independent Islamic schools, as an example, they would have a faith designation in there.
Right.
And that means that they can actually use, they can do a lot of, they can use a lot of religion, if you like, within their curriculum and so on, and overtly promote that, teach that, and they have a license to do that. When you come to, say, your normal maintained state school, it doesn't have a religious designation, so it has to follow the national curriculum. Sure. Although the other schools also follow national curriculum, but they do other things besides the national curriculum, which they are permitted to do. So in a secular, in a maintained school or an academy, if you don't have a religious designation, then you follow the national curriculum. But the act of daily collective worship, as you said, technically there is no such thing as a secular school in this country, because all schools are required by law, by statute, are required to do an act of daily collective worship, which is mainly broadly of Christian character.
Right.
But within that, you can apply for what is called a determination, an exemption, reflecting the family background of the children. You can actually apply for that, which we had applied for, and we were offering an act of worship which was Islamic.
Right.
So your morning assemblies, basically 10 minutes, are Islamic in character. So you will recite from the Quran, and you'll tell some moral story, something spiritual, kindness, forgiveness, respect for teachers, that kind of thing, but rooted within Islamic tradition. So this we did, and indeed quite a lot of other schools did that as well. So this was our practice when it came to...
if I can ask for a further clarification, Tahir, because you obviously, I mean, given your experience in the sector, you know the finer details of this, that in a sense, what you're saying is what is called a faith school, colloquially, is one where they're overtly speaking of, the faith being the truth throughout the day, whereas in a maintained school or an academy, they only do that for 10 minutes in the morning, right? So they're not necessarily saying that this is not the truth. They're still affirming it for those 10 minutes when there's morning prayer. It's just the quantity of that, so to speak, is different.
Yeah, I mean, you could put it that way, certainly. But when we do the assemblies, obviously, they're done from a Muslim perspective.
Right.
They're done from a believer's perspective.
Right. Or a Christian's perspective.
So they're not done in a kind of an RE sense where you are studying the religion of somebody else, for example. Muslims believe this, Christians believe this. It's not like that. It is very much confessional in approach, you might say.
Put it simply, a school that is designated, let's say designated Islamic school, it can organize a school along a very explicit Islamic ethos, right? Or a Roman Catholic school or a Church of England school. It can effectively design its environment in a manner that is overtly and explicitly
Does that go against British values?
No,
that's the question.
As long as they've got that designation, it is okay. If you don't,
so this is interesting again. Why is it if you are not specially designated, you have only 10 minutes of formal? I mean, I'm not saying, incidentally, this is kind of a slightly tangential question because we've clarified very clearly that Parkview was behaving in a way which was entirely in conformity with the legislation in this point. I'm just trying to make a point which is slightly broader, which is that basically, as long as you've got that tick box which says this is a designated faith school, then you can, go against British values, because apparently British values is about not, British values apparently is undermined by teaching sort of a faith.
No, I think where you might have a point is this.
Yeah,
If you look
yeah.
at the schools, for example, many of the Church of England and Catholic schools within
Yeah.
the inner cities are heavily attended by Muslims and other, and very few Catholic or Christians, and yet they are expected to conform to the Christian ethos of that
Right.
school. I
Right.
think you can say that undermines fundamental British values, because effectively you are expecting and demanding that people who do not share that faith must conform to the teachings and values of that faith simply because they attend those schools. I think that you can say undermines fundamental British values, but I haven't seen anyone so far raising that question, which I think would be a very interesting and valid question.
But I want to be even more provocative, if you allow me for a second, and point out that, what is secularism but a normative system of thought which can emerge in intolerant forms, such as muscular liberalism, which tries to impose its own values on everyone else, even though it calls it sort of self more tolerant. But in many respects, I mean, I've actually, I do academic work on this, I've written about this, and I hope to publish a book about this as well. But what's different between secularism and any particular religious tradition? I mean, in reality, if you look at the structure and the morphology, so to speak, of any religious tradition or any secularism resembles that sort of stuff. It's by emerging with a very narrow definition of what constitutes religion that secularism is able to claim, actually, we're not a religion. But that definition of religion doesn't apply to any pre-modern religion. No pre-modern religion didn't think it had a say in all of the areas that secularism now sort of demands that they want to be their special domain. And as a consequence, from the perspective of any pre-modern religion, and certainly from the perspective of Islam, secularism counts as a religion. And if that's being shoved down all of our throats in a very narrow ideological form, which is what we have with muscular liberalism since Cameron's time and beyond, then in effect we all have faith schools. They're just secular faith schools, and everyone, they're all being intolerant.
What's interesting is, isn't there? I think they may now have closed, but wasn't there a new college that was opened in London? I think a higher education institution opened.
Right. New College for the Humanities.
Yes. But if you look at, for example, the likes of Richard Dawkins, how would you class them? Are they fundamentalist secularists? And, would they be welcomed within the school setting, or would they be seen as...
I think most schools would take great pride. Most schools in this country, in practice, would take great pride in having this kind of a august scientific figure who spends a great deal of time vilifying and making sort of derogatory comments about and showing a great deal of intolerance, shall we say, and not contributing to community cohesion about people of faith. But again, I think there is a kind of white privilege attached to that space. That if you are if you speak the language and the culture of a people, then they won't be afraid of you. But if you start saying Assalamu alaikum too often, people will think, oh, they're sort of like Islamizing the school, or they're becoming extremists. Tahir bhai, did you want to?
Let me sort of expand on this idea of Assalamu alaikum and why this particular teacher that Talha was referring to. And I've come across this particular phenomena quite often. So,
right.
But Taha come across in his role as a solicitor, of course. But within the education scene, this is not new to me. I've had hundreds of these cases. So let me sort of try and put my theory on that. The teacher knew full well what Assalamu alaikum means. He really understood it. Okay, I don't believe for a moment he didn't know what Assalamu alaikum meant. I just don't believe that. It's not from my experience. Okay, if he claims that, I don't think he's telling the truth. Right? And the reason why I say that is because I've come across this many times, and came across this not so long ago in a Birmingham school as well, where a teacher was basically asked not to say Assalamu alaikum to the children.
Right.
And this happened in some London schools as well. And I did a bit of a test, like a test with one teacher. He phoned me up and he said, can I ask you a question? I said, yeah, by all means. And he said, well, I normally say Assalamu alaikum to the children, Muslim children, because 99%, 98, 99% children are Muslims in this school. It's in Tahir
Right.
Ahmad's.
Right.
He said, I normally say Assalamu alaikum. It's just a matter of normal thing.
Right.
And the leadership team, who happen to be not Muslims, and we're not talking about the discriminatory layer here within the hierarchy of the school system yet, but the
Right.
hierarchy is not Muslim. He says one of the assistant head teachers has been kind of looking at me in a funny way, and she kind of jokingly, jestingly said to me that I should speak English language. We're trying to promote English, and you shouldn't be speaking in another language. So she said it as if we don't want to be speaking another language. We want to speak English. Speak English, but it's okay to learn French, German, Spanish.
Right.
Yeah, that's okay. But don't speak this funny Assalamu alaikum language. Is what she means. So she says that to him, and he said, I just ignored her because I thought it's just like a light comment. Then I found out that she's kind of been watching me, and she raised it once again. So then that's when he phoned me, and I said, look, this may be an assistant head just raising that. I said, tell you what they're concerned about. And I said, what do you think of the head? Do you think the head teacher is supporting her? And he said, no, the head teacher is very nice. I don't think she'll be doing that. I said, if she made 2-3 attempts at you to stop you from saying Salaam alaikum to the Muslim children in a 98% Muslim people school, I can tell you the head teacher is behind it. Just from my experience, I can tell you that that's likely to be the case. I could be wrong, and I'm happy to entertain the idea, but I'm likely to be right. I tell you that now. So then he went to see, because she continued, and he went to see the head teacher. Then sometime later, he phoned me again, like a few weeks later, and he said, you know what, I think you're right. I went and discussed it with the head teacher, and I was getting all sort of vague and, equivocal answers and responses. She was ducking and diving and whatever. It led me to believe that she was behind the whole thing. So they were discussing this issue that don't allow the Muslim teachers to say Salaam alaikum to the Muslim children. Why? This is a very important question. Something that we would see as completely innocuous and harmless, because if you are of the mind that schooling is an important opportunity to save the Muslim children from the oppression of Islam, okay? Yeah. If your ideological position is that you are there to save the Muslim children from the oppression of Islam, then obviously Muslims expressing their Muslimness, even in something as basic and elementary and pretty, innocent as Assalamu alaikum, it is seen as an expression, as an assertion of Islam and Muslimness within the school. They don't want this culture of Muslim expressiveness, if you like, within the school setting. So this is seen as a little opening, maybe, into an expression of wider requests and things. So you can see that they want to nip it in the bud with something very, very innocent that they shouldn't have a problem with at all, really. So what that indicates is the mindset of the people who are running these schools, that they're trying to suppress, if you like, the expression of Muslimness within the school on something as innocuous as this.
So, in a sense, these people are basically trying to redefine rather innocuous sort of like behaviors as potentially threatening, undermining British values and things like this. I wonder, Talha Bhai, if you could perhaps comment on this particular thought, that are they doing this in a roundabout fashion because now there is legislation which talks about reasonable accommodation of religious needs there's obviously nothing illegal about saying Assalamu alaikum at all. We don't live in a police state. Alhamdulillah, for the most part. I think Tahir Bhai's experience might make him doubt that sometimes. But if you're overtly prejudiced, of course, you could run up against employment tribunals and discrimination cases. So you have to be it quite subtly. And I suspect it's extremely difficult to sort of get convictions on subtle forms of discrimination. So I wonder if that's actually something almost consciously done.
Yeah, I don't practice discrimination law, but I do have some understanding. And my understanding is that it is very difficult to prove discrimination by and
Yeah.
large.
Yeah.
Unless it's so blatantly obvious, it is often
Yeah.
very difficult.
Yeah.
Difficult for a number of reasons, partly because of the resources, because often you would have to fund those legal battles with your own money, and
Right.
very few people,
Right.
including those who earn decent salary, will
Right.
struggle to fund legal battles of this nature. So,
Right.
so as it is, discrimination is very difficult to prove. But also, nevertheless, there is a mechanism. If I directly target you because of your Muslimness or because of your ethnicity or
Right.
disability, there would be a redress. Now, I think the reason this 2014 regulation is problematic is because it effectively gives a channel, another way of barring people, preventing people from participating, for example, in the management of education institutions,
Right.
effectively for their religious or political views, but without being so specific, without saying that I'm preventing you the other thing is, why didn't they say for extremist views, for example, for expressing extremist views? It's not about extremist views. It's
Right.
about undermining fundamental British values. So for me,
Right.
I think the whole legislation was deliberately designed
Yeah.
to give broad scope for people
Right.
to bring all sorts of things in the mix. Same with
Yeah.
so inappropriate. I mean, why would you say so inappropriate? You can be very specific. If you express misogynistic views, you'd be banned. If you express racist views, you'd be banned. If you
Right.
express, I don't know, extremist views, you'd be banned. Why do you say conduct so inappropriate? So
Right.
to
Very
me,
unusual.
It seems it's deliberate. No, to me, it seems like it's deliberately designed to provide a very broad arena to. The other distinct feature in this case is that I give an analogy with housing. So lately, there are a lot of housing regulations brought in to regulate private rented accommodations, right?
Right.
Some
Right.
of those, for example, would require you, although you'll make the case in civil courts, but you would have to meet a criminal threshold, i.e., not on balance of probability, but instead
Yeah.
you have to prove
Beyond
beyond
reasonable
reasonable
doubt.
doubt, right? Now, on this case, and the reason court does that is because if you do that, because the allegations are so serious and because the repercussions that it can have, the legislator take the view that a civil burden of proof is not sufficiently strong.
Right.
Same applies, for example, if you bring an allegation against me as a solicitor. If my
Right.
professional tribunal tries me, the burden of proof is
interesting.
effectively criminal standard.
Right.
Same within the civil claims. If you allege fraud, the burden of proof is often higher than your ordinary civil proof. But
Right.
on this case, when we were arguing Tahir Alam's case, one
Yeah.
of the points we said is that legislation did not stipulate what the standard
Burden
of
of
proof
proof is. Right.
And we say that given the nature of these allegations, it should be a higher standard of proof, not the typical civil standard of proof. But again,
Right.
the tribunal didn't agree with us.
Right.
And I think the legislation deliberately were designed to be vague about it so that it could give a broader margin of error, if you like.
Can I ask
The
a
other-
follow-up? Yeah, sorry,
The
go on.
other,
Tahir, please.
sorry, the other remarkable thing that I ought to say here, Talha, you will remember that, and perhaps you can add to that, was that we put in so many requests for disclosures, and every time the judge turned the disclosures down, they were hell-bent on not disclosing anything. And at one point, we asked specifically, we gave the date, time, and the document will already be ready. It'll take no effort to disclose this document. Okay, there's no burden, no delay, nothing. So we said, just give us the minutes of the Gove and Albert Bohr meeting. Remember, we gave the date and time. We said, just give us one sheet, whatever, 2-3 sheets there, the minutes of the meeting. Let us have them. And they wouldn't even give that. So those sort of things actually are quite. It's certainly not the rule of law, really, and there isn't any justice either when you actually are presenting documentation, which is, the documentation presented against me, which was from the Peter Clark report, which was almost, I calculate the percentage actually, it was 95% redaction. So
Yeah,
there is the disclosure with 95% redaction.
also we
And the
wanted,
person who actually, whose evidence it was, that particular person, was a witness against me, and she gave evidence, she gave witness, but I was not able to see what the statement she has given, and it's 95% redacted. As
How is
if
that
I was
legal?
some kind of dangerous criminal, and I was not able to say, I could not be shown what people have said about me, because I might. The other drama actually these people put up in the court, right, was that we don't. So the some of these witnesses who were the I shan't name them here, but they basically put up this drama that they didn't feel safe, and they felt a bit insecure, and they didn't want to come to court to face Tahir Alam, which is quite incredible. I mean,
I mean, I
and
should
they
add
put
on
up this
this,
whole
Tahir.
drama. Yeah, go
Go
on.
ahead, Tahir, carry on. No, carry on, you carry on.
Yeah, so they put up this drama that there was, they were not safe, and so on, and they appeared, on TV screens, and then the TV screens wouldn't work, and then one of them just turned up in the court. So they were frightened before, and this guy is much taller than I am, right? Happens to be an academic as well, by the way. And three of the witnesses who testified against me, strangely enough, were husband, wife, and their son. So three of the witnesses were basically a family testifying against me, and nobody saw anything wrong with that. That there's a lot of corroboration going on here. It doesn't sound right. So this is
Yeah,
the
I mean,
kind of facade that we're
so I
talking
want,
about. It doesn't bode well for the court system from my point of view. What I've seen, to be honest with you, I had a significant amount of respect for sort of court. No court systems are perfect, of course, but I
Yeah.
didn't know that this is how blatant and bad it would be.
I mean, there are two other points about this process that was really interesting. On the issue of anonymity of some of these witnesses, effectively they sought anonymity on the ground of fear for their safety. And what
Right.
was really shocking, which I could not believe that a tribunal would accept, in support of their assertion as to why they fear for their safety, they used the example of the Glasgow shopkeeper who apparently said something about Prophet Muhammad, and so somebody from Bradford drove down to Glasgow and killed him. You might remember there was
Yes,
someone
yes,
who.
this was yeah.
So they were saying that demonstrates effectively how emotive some of these peoples can be, and
Right.
how dangerous it can be. Uh,
But for the
I
court to take that seriously, of course, is also an absolute legitimation of basically Islamophobic sort of
Well,
paranoia
that's how it's said.
about
But the other issue that that struck me is that the tribunal that was hearing Tahir's case was chaired by a judge who happened to be a Muslim, and despite the fact that this case effectively involved a lot of Muslimness of the governance of the school and so on, or allegation of Muslimness, and yet on the 2 Fridays that we were there, normally we get 1 hour breaks on each usual standard court practice. You'll get 1 hour break for lunch. On both of the Fridays, I don't know if Brother Tahir remembers, on both of the Fridays, our break was reduced to half an hour. So on Fridays, if you had a 1 whole hour, there is a mosque you could go to and pray Jummah. But you couldn't do that because your break was effectively curtailed to half an hour. And I thought, and now you can't say it's Islamophobic or not sensitive to Muslim, because they will simply say, well, you've got a Muslim judge. Seriously, you
Well,
suggest
no, this is where I hope to write about this in future. But the thing is, when people like Khalid Mahmoud are writing against the Trojan Horse Affair podcast and using all the Islamophobic tropes, I mean, it's nice that he quotes Hamza Sayed's comment about, racist judo, because it's an extremely effective way to articulate a practice that plenty of brown people like ourselves unfortunately do engage in, where they take advantage of that weakness, the prejudice that is widespread in society about Muslims and Islamophobia, which they themselves oftentimes have internalized to the degree that I think it's actually reasonable to call them Islamophobes, even if they self-identify as Muslim, because their self-identification of Muslim excludes a lot of the things that we would practice, and they would hold prejudice against those sorts of things and discriminate against us if they found the opportunity. Obviously you're a legal man, so you're not going to say this, but I would consider that judge's behavior to be Islamophobic. I don't think that there's, this is what's so frustrating. I wanted to ask one other question, but it's actually completely slipped my mind. So it will come back to me, inshallah. If you like, Tahir Bhai, you can sort of go on from here, but if you like, I can actually ask you about this government definition.
I just add something?
Extremism.
One of the
please.
things we should bear in mind is that
Yeah.
although the barring order against Tahir doesn't say it's a lifelong bar, but
Right.
it remains until it is overturned,
Right.
it remains in place.
Right.
Now, one of the issues I think before we started broadcasting, you looked at what are the, how can we challenge some of these issues.
Right.
So in respect of Tahir Alam, for example, I think he would be at liberty, provided he has the resources or indeed the will to fight this system again. He is always at liberty to apply at any time, inviting the Secretary of State to revoke that notice. And if the Secretary of State refused to revoke that, he would be entitled to bring another proceedings. But the other point to bear in mind is that although Tahir Alam wasn't in the end banned for so-called Muslim extremism reasons, but given the issues on which his conduct was found to be so inappropriate, I think that the risk remains very live that if and when government or any other authority wants to ban people on similar grounds, the net is spread very widely. And I think we all should be very, very worried. Yes, no one else has been barred since then, but that may simply be because government didn't need to or authorities didn't need to.
The precedent has been set.
The precedent has been set. Yes, not on fundamental British values. The precedent hasn't yet been set, but you could be targeted for, I don't know, for Muslimness, but once they go in, they find these snagging issues, as I said before, and he could be banned on those snagging issues. So the whole publicity would be that you are an extremist, you are this, you are that. But in the end, so the publicity does the damage, but you are continued to be barred on grounds as flimsy as not ticking a box on a particular ground.
So, I remembered the point that I was going to say about your specific case, Tahir Bhai, which is that, when you're being refused to be shown the evidence in some instances of what you're being accused of, etc., and that precedent has also, I don't understand the law as well as a lawyer, of course, but this would seem to set a precedent for the way the bar of the burden of proof and these sorts of things are also problematic in this particular case. When you can't see what you're being accused of, when you don't get disclosures that would seem to be reasonable given the case that you're dealing with, this really underlines, and the fact that Peter Clark and people like this are involved, underlines the securitization of this issue, right? The fact that this is, a very common regulatory question within the realm of education, but it's been taken into the realm of terrorism, which is basically a realm beyond the rule of law almost. This is what was created in the context after 9/11 by a US practice with respect to unlawful combatants, for example, who don't fall under any legal system. But at the same time, your comments, Tahir Bhai, reminded me of secret evidence in military trials against terrorists. And you've been assimilated into that system because Peter Clark has been designated for you. And this is how Muslims can be targeted. Muslims, basically, the presumption of guilt is there, like Ahmad da Costa kind of said in episode 8, that, remember, as a brown person, you will always be presumed guilty. And in addition to that, this entire discourse, Islamophobic discourse around terrorism, is piled upon you, and it's very difficult to get out of that massive a black hole of circumstances. I wonder if you could comment on that, Tahir Bhai. And then there are some questions that have come in the comments, and inshallah we'll address those.
So just succinctly mention your question again. You said quite a few things there.
Yes, I did. I apologize for the elaborateness of what I just said, but I mean, it strikes me that certain mechanisms that are brought about in the state of exception that are used to deal with terrorism, secret evidence, and this sort of stuff, seems to be coming into very unusual sort of menial education policy at sort of the governance of secondary schools in an inner city. Like, what has one got to do with the other? I mean, this is a question potentially for both of you. Like, there's something very perverse in the way that Muslims are being treated and the connections that are being made with these exceptional circumstances that basically eliminate the rule of law. Is there hope for us to come? What can we do about this sort of thing, I suppose? Yeah, I mean, I think at one level we need to express that this is unacceptable and it's outrageous, really.
I mean, one of the things that is important, in this discussion, and the reason why we are continuing to speak up and speak the truth to the Muslim community, and the reason why we want our voices to be heard much more widely, is to develop, some kind of resilience, some kind of courage in the Muslim community as well, because we've been battered for a little while with legislation after legislation coming in, and attacks in the media with respect to the grooming gangs and oppression of women and international kind of situation and terrorism coverage, so much negative coverage, really.
Right.
And I shouldn't say we got used to it, but it's kind of become a bit normal, So when nothing else happens in the media, now the Ukraine story is running, there's nothing about Islam anymore. So one guy, I just went to the local chip shop to get some food, and he said to me, I said, what do you think of the Ukrainian conflict? He said, well, one thing is obvious, they're not going to be talking about Muslims for a while because the Ukrainian conflict is going on.
Right.
So we kind of got used to those things, but I think it's really important actually to challenge these things.
Yeah.
And not to lie down, not to accept these things.
Yeah.
And, if you're going to win justice, justice is never handed to people on the plate. It really doesn't work like that.
Right.
And if we are going to get a space and place, if you like, and get justice, then we have to stand up for that, not just for ourselves, but other people who are wronged as well within society. We should fight for them as well. As a Muslim, of course, we have to stand up for what's right, what's just, regardless, of who they are as well. So I think it's about living Islam, for us to stand up, to speak the truth. The famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, if you see a wrongdoing, a wickedness or an evil, change it with your hand. And if you can't do that, speak against it. And if you cannot even do that, then hate it within your heart. And there's nothing below that by way of Iman. So that's the lowest category. So we should be speaking out. We should be opposing things wherever we can, through our voice, through video medium, through writing mediums, through print mediums, whatever they might be. Right. So this is all about raising the voice, and we should continue to do that, and and try and reverse some of these changes that have been brought about. We were talking about the barring order earlier, that not many other people have been barred, if you like. To some extent, it's not necessary, because the discriminatory framework following the Trojan horse affair, as you know, was made compulsory and mandated across the public sector, including health service and education as well. So in every local authority now, you've got a monitoring department, a surveillance department, which is looking at radicalization, extremism, and taking referrals and creating blacklists of governors, of teachers, of people working in education, and of pupils, and also of families too. So this is the kind of culture that we've sort of arrived at in this country, quite shockingly and rather quickly as well. This is quite different from my experience just 15 years ago. I was paid to recruit more people from the ethnic minorities generally, but from the Muslim community in particular as well, because the representation on governing bodies within the education system was so very, very low and people didn't participate. So I was tasked and paid to promote these things, to increase the ethnic minority population, to have appropriate reflection in a stakeholder model.
Right.
And those are, so we've shifted away from the idea of the democratic idea, if you like, of the stakeholder model, that people whose children come to those schools, they should be able to influence and shape the education of their children. And this goes back to a more fundamental right, which is a fundamental human right, actually, that people should be able to raise their children according to the philosophical convictions of their parents. This is a very fundamental right, in international law and so on, that people should be able to do that. It's not for somebody else to say, well, they are your children, but let me do all the value bits for them. And this is what actually, this is the core of the issue here. So what we've had is a shift from the values of respecting that particular value to one where that value is no longer being honored. So it's about now fundamental British values, which have been devised and constructed within the context and in opposition to, say, Islamic values. Because the fundamental British values didn't exist 10 years ago. They've just come along now. So the people in the 1980s and the 70s, they were not living under British values. Well, the values that are being cited as being British values, they are quite common, actually. They're not necessarily British, they're international values. A lot of people would see some benefit and merit in those values. For example, respect for other religions and faiths and so on. Yeah, I would say that's kind of respectful treatment of those religions is a fundamental Islamic value as well. So this is an artificial framing, if you like.
Tahir, can I interrupt you briefly, because you told me this fascinating anecdote about a conversation you had with a journalist, a very frank conversation, where he eventually kind of, he was comfortable enough to give you a frank answer to the question of, okay, well, what is British values, and what is, how do we really understand what British values is? What is the opposite of British values? If you can just repeat that anecdote briefly.
Yeah, it was very interesting. He spent about 4 or 5 hours with me, and he was writing a book. So he was just having a discussion with me. We had food together, and he got to know me. He used to ask me many, many questions, and I just answered them, in a straightforward manner. And then I said, do you mind if we were speaking about these British values, and I said, can I ask you a very frank question, and I want you to give me an answer as quickly as you can, while discussing this particular item. I said, what do you think is the opposite of British values? He said Islamic values. Straight away. He said, Tahir, the opposite is Islamic values, because the formation of the idea of British values within education, is a reaction to, if you like, the Islamic values. If they've come in because of the Islamic values, people have looked at that and they thought, how can we, if you like, do something that would counteract those things, and they come out with fundamental British values. And that's his view. That's not my view. That's what he said to me.
I certainly think that the people who came up with these ideas were thinking in those ways. But as you've pointed out, the ideas that are, and I'll just put them on the screen, about how the government has defined extremism in Prevent as a strategy of vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values. And then it explains a bit, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, mutual respect, of different, and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. And as you pointed out, these are in fact Islamic values in various ways, but they're interpreted, because they're very general and vague, they can be interpreted to actually victimize Muslims, which is what I would argue is happening in your case and is happening in many cases. So yeah, I mean, it's a very frustrating state of affairs. I didn't mean to interrupt you. If you would like, because I'm also a bit conscious of the time for both of you. I really appreciate how much time you've given. If you would like to sort of complete what you were saying, please feel free. And otherwise, there are 1 or 2 questions that have come up that we could sort of have a look at, if that's okay.
Let's go to the questions, I think, and then finish it.
Okay, so someone is earlier asking, this is a bit of an early question, so either one of you can answer this. Should Muslims organizations view the British Humanist Association as good faith interfaith interlocutors considering the role that they played in the Trojan Horse affair? It's an interesting question. Because I actually I'm friends with the dialogue officer at the British Humanists.
I had the privilege of appearing in Newsnight panel with one of the, I think the CEO of Humanist Association.
Copson, Andrew Copson.
I believe so. The name escapes me at the moment. But the point I would say is that in their response in relation to what we now call Trojan Horse, I certainly did not find them to be objective, fair, or just. I found them to be exploitative to the extent that you would expect any other Islamophobe to exploit those. So what conclusion do you draw from that? I leave it to the imagination of everybody who is listening, but I certainly did not find them in relation to he was very keen to say that how pleasant Tahir Alam was, and he had the privilege of working with him in the past. But my point is that I did not find their position to be reasonable or evidence-based or fair or objective.
Right. I should say that I have publicly on Twitter invited them to have a conversation with me or a dialogue with me on the Trojan Horse Affair podcast. And so far I have had no luck. I have a good friend with whom I've engaged in 2 or 3 dialogue sessions in the past, including on this channel, Jeremy Rodell, who is their dialogue officer. But I don't mind. It doesn't need to be Jeremy. It can be anyone to come and have that conversation. And I agree that, to be honest, so often, these are, I think a lot of the time very well-meaning, but deeply prejudiced assessments of what Islam is or what religion is to a certain extent. And one of the points that I made to Jeremy in my previous video on this channel was, the sort of secularism that you uphold is actually a religion unto itself, right? But it's very difficult for sort of people of that outlook, obviously, who have dedicated their lives to defining themselves in opposition to religion, to accept such a perspective. But once you drill down to the sort of components of what they're presenting, it's very difficult, I think, to come to any other conclusion. We do have a few other comments and questions, but they're mostly comments. I think, this has been extremely valuable, and I want to perhaps give the closing words to the two of you as the guests here. So the one point that I want to highlight is that Talha Bhai and Tahir Bhai, you both highlighted the importance of the journey forward. We need to actually have an initiative to try and somehow combat this. But at the same time, it will require huge amounts of money. There's something systemically problematic here, because people who are discriminated against are liable to be the poorest and least resourced people in the community. But they're supposed to somehow bring all of this financial resources to be able to combat the discrimination of the system against them. So in that sort of spirit, I want to encourage any viewers who might be familiar with philanthropists who would be willing to underwrite this sort of work to get in touch with people like Brother Tahir Alam and Brother Talha Ahmad or myself, and I will connect you to them. My email is available on my university website. But beyond that, I wanted to leave the floor to the two of you, whoever wants to go first, just to give us some closing reflections, inshallah. Sorry, you're on mute.
Brother Tahir, you want to go first?
No, you have a go. It's fine.
Fine, okay. So when I was looking through the skeleton argument which the counsels for the government or the Secretary of State presented, so in support of their allegation that Tahir Alam conducted his sought to undermine fundamental British values, the very first task or action or evidence they cite is a report that he authored, or rather edited, when he was chair of the Education Committee of the Muslim Council of Britain.
Right.
And their characterization was that that report represents a fundamental approach to aspects of Islamic faith, and he sought to impose that within the schools that he was able to influence. Now, I mention that because so what was under scrutiny was not just the conduct of Tahir Alam, but also a publication of Britain's preeminent Muslim representative organization.
Right.
And I could not believe for the life of me that despite that, neither MCB nor any major Muslim group came forward to challenge that within the legal framework. They certainly could have done when we were litigating. They could have come in as intervener in a limited scale or indeed other capacity. That highlights the difficulty that we have faced and will continue to face in issues such as this. Muslim community, in many respects, economically, socially, politically, is among probably the least advantaged group within the wider society. And yet many of the state's current excesses are aimed at the Muslim community. So to move forward, one of the lessons I learned from this case, and one of the lessons I think we all need to reflect on and try and subscribe to, is this: that one, those of us, regardless of our faith, color, and political, social views, if we genuinely claim to care for and value a pluralistic society, we must come forward in defense of those who are at the relatively weaker end of our society. From the Muslim community's perspective, we should stop thinking that somebody, whether it's state or civil society or anybody else, is going to make our case for us, or that they will make the society better for us. We must find our ways of channeling our voice, including challenging defective, biased, and often hateful characterization of the Muslim community, be it through the government mechanism or indeed through the media. And if we do not organize to do so, then I'm afraid the situation, the dire state that we find ourselves in relation to Islamophobia will continue for many, many years to come.
Jazakumullah khair. Barakallah fikum. I mean, we have some very grateful messages, such as someone saying, "May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward Brother Tahir and all of you," and mashallah, a number of messages of this nature. Brother Tahir, would you like to give us our closing thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to refocus actually we've gone to a lot of detail and just go back to the beginning point. So what was the aim or the goal in these interventions by the Secretary of State for Education? What we are talking about here is the education of Muslim children. And I think that going forwards, this is what we have to really focus on. Because the aim and the target and the goal is to do with the education of Muslim children. It's got nothing to do with me. Nobody's personally got anything against me. But it's what I was doing for the Muslim children which became an issue in the end.
Right.
So what the Muslim community can do is to educate our children in a very upright manner, and in terms of educating them Islamically, in terms of their knowledge, their practice, their spiritual development, their moral development. So this is what is the most important thing to happen. So, and that approach to doing that, to raising our children upon Islam and developing their shakhsiyah al-Islamiyah, is the most important project there is.
Right.
There's nothing else more important than that. If Trojan horse is anything to do with that, if it is to do with anything, it is to do with the education of children and how they are raised. And the barring orders that were being pursued against the teachers cited this particular reason. They said, we're not banning them because what was it that they actually breached? What was their crime, so to speak, for which they needed to be barred by the NCTL? And it was to do with this, that they are promoting their own culture to the children, if you like, was the accusation that was being devised. So in other words, in a 99% Muslim pupils, Muslim teachers must not promote any of their own cultural aspects to these children. In other words, so what should you promote then? Promote something else. Maybe try to secularize them, maybe do something else to them. Can you see? So what's a really important message to take away from all of this, of course, is that we should raise our children upon Islam unashamedly through our own institutions, whether they are mosques within the home environment and so on, and sending them to Islamic schools, establishing Muslim schools, And also, and I'm not one to call it for disengagement or anything. I think it's very important
Absolutely.
for Muslims to also go into the teaching profession
Right.
and to continue to participate as governors, to continue to participate becoming directors, establishing education institutions, and
Right.
so on. These are very important things to pursue and not to be deterred. Because the goal of those who attacked people like me is to actually deter other people from even getting into
Precisely.
this profession.
Precisely.
So we must not allow them to succeed really in psychologically getting us to disengage from these things and to disconnect from these things, because the fact of the matter is that these are important areas of civic life and professional careers and so on. Muslims need to be active in all of these areas, particularly in education. People should get into these professions and be involved in these things and make sure that our children are educated, not just in academic brilliance, but also in terms of their spirit and moral brilliance and excellence as well.
And this will, of course, as you have, very eloquently pointed out in the series of podcasts, will of course make Britain stronger. We will contribute to a true sense of British values, which will be enriched by, great contributions from members of the Muslim community. In the same way, mashallah, that I think both of you actually exemplify in your own careers, and that you've spent your lives, of course, Tahir Bhai, for much longer than either of us have spent your lives sort of doing. So, Jazakumullah khair. Tahir Bhai, you're an inspiration for us all. May Allah preserve you, and Talha Bhai, really appreciate your time and your support for Tahir Bhai.
I mean, on the point of inspiration, I do want to say that when I came to Britain at 15, Tahir Alam was one of the first persons that I got to know.
MashaAllah.
And I knew in those days I was a student, and he's been a great resource in terms of when I was going about in my school. So in a way, I did feel privileged when I was able to represent him in court, and I have sympathy for where he finds himself, but I'm sure Allah will reward him for the hard work and commitment that he has put in.
Absolutely.
I do remember Talha actually as well. I remember the first time I met him.
MashaAllah.
He phoned me and he invited me. He asked me some questions about prayer facilities, and he established some kind of Islamic society in Small East School. He spoke to me about that. And then he invited me to come there to speak. I'm not sure if you remember that or not. But anyway,
I do.
MashaAllah.
Yeah, so that's when I got introduced to him.
I did in fact comment that if when I was a student at my sixth form, Prevent was around, only Allah knows where I would have found myself, given how assertive and forceful I was about what our school must do to cater for us.
Right.
I know exactly where you have been. I mean, where you would be. I mean, don't have to be secretive about that. You would have gone onto the Prevent list, and your father would have been paid a visit and say, your son's got this view, that view, and they would have created a little file for you. Right. It would have sat in the safeguarding officers, safeguarding lead in Small East School, and also at Birmingham City Council. They would have your name there as well. And the names of all your siblings would be there as well, because you got very strong views about, political views, other views, which would be regarded as extremist. So you went to Small East School at the right time, I think, and now would be the wrong time.
And this further underlines to all our viewers the significance of this battle, the absolutely essential nature that what our children are being robbed of right now is why we must fight for justice in this case, inshallah, because of the ramifications it has. So once again, Jazakumullah khairan to both of you. I really appreciate your taking the time, being able to discuss your thing at length. And, I hope to see you again. I mean, inshallah, I'm sure there are many ways in which we can continue this conversation, and when those opportune moments come up, as they will do in the coming days. I mean, Tahir Bhai, you've been kind enough to actually offer a fair amount of your time, but I'll be liaising with you in particular, and Talha Bhai as well, with respect to other cases that might be pertaining to this. Of course, you're, as a professional, you're giving of your professional knowledge freely, and we really appreciate that here as well. So, Jazakumullah khairan again. May Allah bless you both, and may Allah give us the tawfiq to really behave in a way that's right. We know that the akhirah is where true justice comes, but we want to help our brothers and sisters, and we want to help Britain ultimately, right? I mean, we're all here committed to the well-being of this country, and this country will only do better if it upholds justice in the way that it treats its most vulnerable people in so many ways. Please do stick around. I'm going to say my proper goodbyes. Sorry?
Now, I was just saying, one of the Prophet's important characteristic was that he cared for his people, and he was joyous in their joys and aggrieved by their grievances.
Right.
So Britain is our country, and we are commanded by our faith to feel for the people of Britain, and do whatever we can to make our lives better, their lives better, all of our lives better.
Inshallah. That's a beautiful note on which to end, actually. And please do stick around. I'm going to sort of see you in the green room, but until next time, I want to thank you again, and thank you to all the viewers who've stuck with us for the last nearly 2 hours. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.